Welcome back to Story Hustler. I'm Dylan.
And I'm Mike.
We have a anniversary episode in a way because it is the 20th anniversary since your documentary, Colorado City and the Underground Railroad. And while 20 years have passed and things have changed, it seems like the
Wow.
story has just remained the same with
Isn't
different
that true?
players.
We watched it the other night. We hadn't sat down and watched it, and watching it together is always interesting. But yeah, 20 years since this documentary that we sort of put together on the fly, and it was probably the of my entire career. I'm proud of a lot of the stuff I did. I did some other garbage that is I'm not so proud
Say,
of. But that body of work that Colorado City and the Underground Railroad, I think, is the thing for which I am the most proud.
well, you won a Murrow Award and an Emmy,
Yeah,
so I think that the public might agree. Maybe not.
yeah. Well, it certainly had a profound impact, I think, at the time, and so as we sort of recognize this 20th anniversary of this documentary, I think you put it in the context of where we are today with this story that we've now been covering for the last 2 years.
The Sam Bateman saga, which we label it the Sam Bateman saga, but honestly, the story as told in your doc and now it's really the story of women, powerful, brave women and girls that use their voices and stand up to this patriarchal cult that
Yeah,
just continues to abuse them.
and that's so important to point out. I think, we've been talking about the Sam Bateman case. We talk about the Warren Jeffs case. These guys are sort of just knockoffs of the same manipulative men who get themselves into power and then just go crazy,
Abuse it.
feeding their own perverted appetites for power and money and women. Those guys are very similar. It's the stories that we told in the documentary, and I'm hoping that we've sort of conveyed through our coverage of Sam. Those guys are not the story. Those
No.
guys are just manipulative men taking advantage of a situation. The real story is the powerful women who get up and say no.
And it's interesting because, well, the reason you kind of got into the FLDS story at all was because our family, Mormon family, we're not Mormon now, but you were raised Mormon
Yeah,
and
and
mom
your
was raised
mother
Mormon.
was, yeah.
And polygamist is definitely, some to say it's a sore subject for Mormons. Others are
Oh,
just kind of like, well, it's our history, it's in the past, we've moved on.
yeah. Well, for whatever explanation or rationalization they may have. When I was a kid going to Sunday school and primary, the theology never really interested me very much. The
Yeah,
spirituality of it, but the history fascinated
it
me.
is
How did we
fascinating.
get there? For the pioneers coming to Utah and then setting up this empire that was really very successful and based on polygamy
Hmm.
throughout Utah and Arizona, and it was I got polyg ancestors, and I think your mother does, and so we come through it. It's part of our family history. Certainly, the Mormon Church is part of our family, your family history, my family history, and the history of how it all came to be is what I think I've tried to follow, certainly in terms of these fundamentalists who have gone off to live by what they think is the true teachings
The
of the church.
righteous way of life. And it's also interesting. I think people are so fascinated by Mormons. I mean, you have the Real Housewife or Real Lives of Secret Lives of Mormon Wives, whatever that show is. Like,
And then the
that's now
sister
popular. And the
wives,
sister wives, because it's a relatively newer religion. Like, it doesn't go back as far as,
well, and
like
that's the
Catholicism and
not
Christianity.
yeah, and that's why in some ways that's sort of a hard thing for the Mormon Church because it's all in basically chronological, chronicled history
Mhm.
that's laid out there, and so the warts, the goods, the bads, it's sort of all there in what is almost modern day history. So
Yeah.
yeah, it's
People are fascinated
and
by
this
them.
and obviously this is the Mormon Church and its theology and the fundamentals. There's a lot of stories, but I got early on the story of sort of the criminality
Mhm.
that is I think associated when you have that kind of power structure between men and women.
But
And the
specifically in the fundamentalists, not the mainstream.
That's what I'm saying.
Gotta
And so really
differentiate.
our my focus has always been sort of the fundamentalist community, and because I was sort of became friends with some of the key players in that world early on. A man named Alex Joseph, who was a famous sort of flamboyant polygamist,
Prophet.
who was became a mayor of a town in Utah, and got to know some of these people early on, and covered the LeBaron story, way back when, and so got in. But the FLDS really became the focus of most of my work, and that's what's represented in this documentary, Colorado City and the Underground Railroad.
The mainstream FLDS, because obviously we've mentioned, like, Tom Green
Yeah, and he was one
and
of those independents who just sort of went off and did his own thing out in the desert, but then invited cameras in to record
yeah,
it, and that always gets these guys in trouble because when they let in the light of day, you
you
start
see
to
what's going on behind
usually
closed
see
doors.
what's going on. But
But
and in doing this, we noted some parts of the documentary that I think are still speak today in
yeah,
terms of Sam Bateman.
yeah, exactly. We watched the doc and we made notes of some of the quotes that were pretty significant. And honestly, if you didn't know that that doc was about Warren Jeffs specifically, you could put them in today's context of Sam Bateman and his whole Samuelites group, and they would ring true, so true today.
Yeah.
It was, it's disturbing, it's fascinating, but it's just shows that this is a never ending story and it's the same story over and over again.
Let's show
So
a couple of those sound bites right now. We're just pulling some things from the documentary, some of the brave women who stood up early.
It absolutely is a cult. They use brainwashing. It's they use terror to control these kids.
I think women should have the right to say yes or no, or, you know, I think they should have a right to say what's going on with their lives and what's going to go on with their children's lives.
Did you have any say like that in your life?
No.
Well, with the young girls, they're like a trophy. And then once a man gets them and takes what he wants, then they're shoved under the rug. And the man is looking for another trophy and another trophy.
These kids are being abused, and the authorities refuse to help them.
Ruth, how old were you when you got married?
16.
16 years old. How old were you when you became pregnant with your first child?
16.
16. And this was an arranged marriage by the religious leaders of that town?
Yes.
Yes. They told you who to marry.
Yes.
So those are just a couple of the interesting clips that we thought were still valid today, still rang true today with the Sam saga. One interesting one was when you covered the running of the fawns, those two young
Oh
girls
yeah,
who were
the
friends and had the
flight of the
same, the
fawns.
flight of the fawns. One thing that was interesting is they wanted education and they wanted to continue to go to school. And that was very prevalent in the Sam Bateman case. Some of the young girls testified talking about how they're in school now and they're going to go to college and
Yeah.
how they're really looking forward to continuing their education and, just moving forward with their lives instead of being isolated in this cult.
Right.
So we thought that was really fascinating because, yeah, all these young girls have kind of just been stripped of the choices in their lives from a young age,
Right.
married off, impregnated, and taken out of school.
And the night that this happened, it was a significant moment in this whole sort of struggle. Two young women named Fawn Holm and Fawn Broadbent that had the same name. Two young 16-year-olds had run, and Flora went up. We went up with the great Flora Jessup and to sort of rescue these girls. And this is some of what they had to say.
I don't want to become some 50-year-old man's wife or something like that.
I want to go to school and get an education.
You want to get an education? How much education have you had thus far?
Probably like to 7th grade.
You're a runaway at this point.
I am.
You're a runaway.
Yeah. I don't want what's out there.
You're 16. Do you think they're about to marry you? Would they marry you if you stayed out there?
Yeah.
Soon?
I don't know. I think so. Can't talk to boys. That's it's like really wicked. You can't do anything. Can't watch movies or TV or anything. You can't dress like you want to.
We've always been told that people out here were wicked, and I don't believe everyone is wicked.
Shall I tell you a secret? Something that I found out when I left. It's true, we're all wicked. But we're not as wicked as them.
Another interesting quote, a little bit of a self-serving quote, but it is true. And Penny Peterson, a very strong woman in this, who helped bring about a ton of change, along with Flora Jessup, two pivotal players in the early days of this.
No doubt.
Penny said that basically, like, no one will go into Colorado City and cover this besides you.
I would love people to see and understand that lifestyle. We've got 1,000,000 cameras in Afghanistan, but nobody, except for you, will go into Colorado City and show this abuse and this lifestyle. People out here are oblivious to it.
But it's kind of true today. Like, it doesn't seem like anybody wants to cover this. I was just in Austin, Texas in the airport, and I was in the bathroom, and in the stalls, they have an end human trafficking. Like, if you're being trafficked, call this number,
Right.
or if you see it. So there's just seems to be in this country a heavy push to stop human trafficking,
Which is good.
which is great. I'm all for it. But then you actually have cases of human trafficking happening, and there's no media outlets covering it. Or there's very few media outlets, I should say, because there was a young man who was covering it.
You're talking about the Bateman trial.
Yes, and just even the Warren Jeffs trial. Like, it seemed like the day-to-day things that led to the downfall of Colorado City and Hilldale, Utah, no one really was there for the day-to-day. They would drop in for the big, juicy headlines of like court cases
Or
or like
special.
yeah, some
report.
special. But it's like what really brings about change is when you go in day to day and you show the ins and outs of this community and how it works and how it's not just a one-off thing of abuse. It's constant, perpetual abuse and brainwashing of these young kids and women.
And it was going on 40 years ago when I basically started this.
Mhm.
It was going on 20 years ago when we did the documentary. And it's clear with Sam Bateman, and I think the edicts that Warren is still issuing, it's going on today. And that's, as an old man, it becomes sort of frustrating. You think you're sort of, screaming into the wind. Uh, and most of the change has been forced by, not by law enforcement being proactive. It's by activists and reporters finding these guys, dragging them into the light of day, and then saying, cops, what are you going to do about it? And it seems like that's exactly what happened with the Sam Bateman case again.
Yeah, so it's just frustrating to hear this cry for ending human trafficking, which we should, but then you have real cases and people ask us why we cover it. It's like, well, the only way to stop it is by putting heat on these guys, because
And that's the thing.
I mean, you had heat on Warren Jeffson. They stopped the marriages for a few, I don't know, generations.
Well, you had about 12 years, a 12-year period where they just stopped the marriages, and much of that sort of what has gone on with Warren really created the environment that Sam was, fragmenting these families, women and children scattered with all these various caretakers, all of them in need of a profit.
Mm-hmm.
A guy like Sam Bateman was going to come and there's this moratorium on sex, so nobody can have families, nobody, and that pressure was not going to last. It was going to blow up, and it did with Sam Bateman and Moroni Johnson.
Yeah.
In this fascinating tell. And then the histories are all linked together. This whole story we're talking about, the sound bites and the cries of the women are the same. The behavior of the men is pretty much the same. They're just trying to find some little corner where they can do it off. Sam broke the rules because he drew attention to himself.
Yeah, well, Penny, another quote that I want to get into from the doc from way back when, Penny talks about how these men convince their followers or people around them that they talk with God and God's telling them to do all of this so they can get away with this abuse under the guise of like, oh, I'm a righteous man and this is what God is telling me to do.
Right.
So I want to play that quote for you now.
They think they have all the power. They think they talk with God. God tells them what to do. And they go in and take these young girls and rape them and marry them and have their babies and beat them and scare them to death. And pretty soon the girls are so brainwashed they don't talk.
And what Penny is speaking, the person Penny is speaking about there is a guy named Orson William Black, one of the most notorious bad guys. And he's still out and he's free. Avoided charges. Arizona had charges against him for many years and they dropped it. But he's just one more guy who used the same sort of theology to springboard into his own insanity. and was very abusive to a whole bunch of young women. But she's talking about, but what she's saying, what these guys do is what Warren did, what everyone was talking about, how Sam brainwashed, the testimony that he would repeat stuff and, he's a con man with a bunch of lines that like keep sweet and perfect obedience, and you get nauseated listening to the mind games that these guys play. But yeah, I think this, Penny, and while we're talking about Penny, Flora Jessup, and Ruth Stubbs, we wouldn't be here talking about any of this if it hadn't been for the courage of Flora Jessup, the courage of Ruth Stubbs, the courage of Penny Peterson. And then you had other women like Alyssa Wall and Rebecca Wall and
Sherry
Carol.
Beth Taylor.
A lot of, Sherry Beth Taylor, Carolyn Jessup, who became very active for a period of time. There's a whole slew of women, and they're women who made the changes. And if this is what this history, it's not Warren Jeff's story. It's Flora Jessup's story. It's Ruth Stubbs' story. It's not Sam's story. And I'm hoping we can talk to some of these young women. We're protecting their names now, but it's their story. These guys are just a dime a dozen pervy prophets. The people who made the change and did the right thing are women who came from inside.
Mm-hmm. Definitely. And one very fascinating facet of your doc is one particular man that you interviewed happened to be Sam Bateman's own father, Deloy Bateman, who back in your original documentary was sounding the alarm for guys like Warren and how one man controls it all. Like he's calling the Warren Jeffs thing a cult back then when he was their teacher of the young kids.
And
yeah.
It makes me feel old because I have definitely now covered this through several generations of families. But one of the main interviews in the documentary, Colorado City and the Underground Railroad, was with a man named Deloy Bateman, who at the time was a very well-respected school teacher in the school up there. And he was sounding the alarm early on because younger and younger girls were disappearing from his classes, knowing that they'd been taken off to be married and impregnated. And he stood up and very vocally spoke out against Warren Jeffs, and I think was really a noble hero at the time. And my best wishes to Deloy. But his son now is at the center of this insane story where he just went completely,
Yeah, I feel like it kind of points to the idea that in that culture, your kids are taught that they're not yours. They belong to the priesthood.
Right.
So, like, the fact that you'd have such an outspoken advocate against Warren Jeffs in Deloy.
And he was kicked out, so I'm sure Sam was raised
Sam
by
was
another man.
a caretaker. So again, the fragmented families and the impact that has long term. Like, it's just fascinating.
That's the biggest damage that Warren has done. There are no real sort of true
familial ties.
Yeah, well, no, nuclear families, and at least even the odd polygamous sense, because he's just taken the entire 2 generations of kids away from their parents and given them to caretakers so that they're property of the prophet.
Yeah, it's
facilitated much of the damage that he continues to do. But let's drop in a soundbite from our old friend Deloy Bateman.
There are very few girls that actually survive clear to the end of high school.
Most of the girls don't graduate because they're married off.
They're married off before they graduate.
Are they told by the religious leaders whom they're to marry?
Oh, absolutely. Nobody is permitted to make that decision for themselves. This is a new leader, and if he was to ask for violence, there's undoubtedly that's what he would get.
People are that devoted to this guy?
Absolutely. There's people that would kill for him in an instant.
So definitely fascinating to see the parallels between 20 years ago and the current story going on. Doesn't seem to change. The players just kind of seem to change a bit.
Names and faces change, but
not even the names.
Yeah, that's true.
The names
not here. They don't. Yeah.
So it's just a convoluted, complicated web of a religious cult that never seems to cease. They just kind of go underground. Right. And you have heat on them. So that's what we have hoped to do with this small channel. So thank you for sticking with us and allowing us to ramble in these episodes.
Yeah.
We definitely do that sometimes.
Well, and that's what when you've got 40, you and I have been sort of nonstop on this for about 3, almost 4 years now. I've been doing it 40. So you end up getting too many stories and too many. But there is a constant theme that of abuse with guys like this. Sam and we've got a lot coming up because Sam Bateman is going to be sentenced unless they move it
Supposedly.
again on December 9th. We're going to be in court for that. Torrance and Liddell will be sentenced shortly after. I think the judge is going to throw the book at all of these guys. That's my bet. But in the between now and Sam's sentencing and in that time frame, we've got a lot planned.
Yeah, so we've got a couple interviews, hopefully that will get scheduled and up on our channel coming up.
People with some really interesting insights, main
Yeah,
players
main players.
in the trial and the investigation and
Yeah,
some of the people
everything.
involved. So we're hoping we're going to be able to provide some really interesting interviews.
Yeah, and possibly some jurors that served on the Torrance and
We've
Liddell.
been speaking to some, yeah.
Yeah, so we're hopefully going to talk to them a little bit and get their thoughts on I mean, obviously they're kind of coming in with fresh eyes to this story, and we don't have fresh eyes, so
no, and
it'll be interesting.
From what we know, it sounds like it was fairly traumatic for these jurors, and I'm not surprised a bit about that.
No, so they've been offered counseling by the government to the jurors because
I
of
hope
what
they
they
took
heard.
it.
Yeah, I do too.
You and I should go get a little counseling after them.
Oh,
we're good.
Yeah, it's just frustrating, and we hope that we've done justice for the young women and young girls. And
they're the story.
They're the story.
And there's going to be, I know there are production companies who are approaching us and want help, and or they're going to do this. And I hope if they do that, they focus on the real players and the important message that you women who grab their voice and seize their power can change the world. And that's been the story from the day I started covering this.
And this religion, this FLDS mainstream sect, will continue to traffic young girls if no one talks about it. So that's the moral of our story.
And they're the big guys, and then there's the sort of independents. And the problem with Sam,
the renegades.
The renegade. And I'm gonna always sort of feel terrible. I have a weight on my chest on this. I knew about Sam, and I wish more had been done. My challenge to law enforcement is that if it takes somebody as flamboyant and sort of silly and reckless as Sam Bateman to go do all of this stuff, if it takes all of that to get busted, then you're never going to catch somebody. You're never going to catch somebody who's just slightly smarter and slightly more discreet.
Yeah. It's
very discouraging.
Very discouraging, but
hey,
we hope that there are lessons learned.
And there's good stuff. And I think in some of the interviews we've got coming up, I think there's valuable things that we can share with our audience that our guests can provide. So anyhow,
hopefully we ask the right questions. That's kind of on us. So wish us luck.
Thank you. It's good to be back.
Good to be back.
And we got some big changes in the just sort of arrangement of the show coming, but we're going to talk about that more later.
That's not important.
Yeah, not now.
Yeah. So this is Story Hustler. Thanks for sticking with us. If you have, like and subscribe, share with your friends. We're hoping to build this community a little more. So signing off, I'm Dylan.
I'm Mike.
Good night, everyone.